Recently, I made a video where I gave you some of my favorite vintage style patterns that are not actually vintage. They're modern patterns so that you can knit something that looks like it's the style, but it doesn't actually make you go through all the problems of working with an actual vintage pattern. And because you guys liked that video so much, I decided to make another one. So here are more knitting patterns that look vintage but are actually modern. This time, not only am I going to give you some sweaters, some tops, some color work patterns, but I'm also going to give you a few accessories because I truly believe that the accessories of your vintage style outfit is what really make it or break it, or can really elevate it to the next level and make it look more like in the style. And it's also an easy way of getting into vintage style knitting without committing too much. So let's get started and go right into it. The first pattern that I have to recommend to you is a top that I ran into randomly on Instagram, I think, and immediately I thought this looks just like a 1940s style blouse, and it is the melon blouse by Beatus Sturkor. I did not know the designer before I found this, and I'm not even sure that she had the 1940s in mind, but it checks all the boxes. It has a beautiful yoke with a detail on it. It has the slightly puffy sleeve. It has the more boxy type of construction. So all in all, a 1940s style, absolutely. If you were to knit it in cotton, this will be great for the summer. But even though it's like a 3/4 sleeve, I feel like if you wanted to wear it for the winter, it would also look great with a long sleeve. I love this pattern. The design is beautiful. It has like a triangle shape yoke design on it. And I mean, it's just so classy. I love it. I do want to know, however, that this pattern only comes in 4 sizes. So it's not quite size inclusive, but most of the patterns that I'm going to mention afterwards are. So stay along if you want more size inclusive patterns. The next pattern is by my favorite designer, of course, Fabled Knitwear, who I mentioned on my last video because so many of her patterns have a vintage style and even from different eras. But this specific one is very high on my list of knits that I want to make from her. And it goes beyond because I think it has like an antique type of look, so not quite even vintage, but like very early 1900s. And I'm talking about the Bernadette turtleneck. Now, I don't know if she called it Bernadette because of Bernadette Banner on YouTube. If you are at all into vintage style and vintage sewing, you know who Bernadette is. Maybe it's just a coincidence, but I love that she called it that. And it is a pullover sweater with a high turtleneck and very, very puffy sleeves that actually end in a more tight sleeve at the end, so that gives them even puffier look, I think, but also kind of keep them out of the way from your hands so that you can do stuff with them. And it is 100% inspired by the early 1900s, Edwardian era of these type of sweaters. They usually were more like ribbing in the body, but that type of sleeve looks just like those bicycle riding sweaters if you've ever seen them. Again, like Edwardian, late Victorian era. Beautiful, so unique, and very high on my list of knits to make. Of course, if you look for different kind of vintage style, she has a lot of other designs, not just the ones I mentioned in this video or in my last video, so definitely check her out as a vintage style designer. Another designer that I love, and I actually did not mention her before, is Sydney Crabo, who has the Squeeze School of Vintage Knitting on Patreon, and she makes a lot of reproduction vintage patterns. So basically she takes original vintage patterns and she makes them more modern, or she takes inspiration from them and then makes her own version. And she's 100% size inclusive in all of her patterns, so you can make sure that they will be the size for you. And 2 of the patterns that I really like from her collection, the first one is the Rose Street cardigan, which is a beautiful sweet cardigan, and again 1940s style. A lot of knitwear that is more vintage looking, I feel like it's from the 1940s. And it has the puff sleeve and the more square cardigan. It just being a cardigan, I feel like automatically makes it look more vintage style. And this one features a beautiful design on the sleeves that is more of a lace, but she does mention it's a very simple lace, so it's great for beginners if you've never knit lace. I think that's great because sometimes what I find that when I knit cardigans, they're kind of boring a little bit because they're all stuck in it. And this one really gives it an extra twist of not just a beautiful design, but something fun to knit. Another pattern from Sydney that is absolutely gorgeous is the Monroe sweater, which, as its name mentions, is literally a reproduction of a sweater that Marilyn Monroe wore in a picture. It's a 1953 sweater, and it features such beautiful cable all around. But again, she made the reproduction for you, so it is written in modern terms and it's 100% size inclusive. I think this is a gorgeous pullover. It's so beautiful. It's like it's giving ski, it's giving 1950s, it's giving Marilyn. It's just everything. I love the cables on it. And it doesn't look too complicated either. This just looks like a really fun pullover. I love it in white, but I always go into all the projects when I want to see other versions of it. It's great for cosplaying Marilyn or just feeling toasty in the winter and, you know, channeling your inner Monroe. I love that she made this reproduction. I'm mentioning a few reproductions in this video, and it's a great way of getting into actual vintage knitting without any of the thinking that you have to do when you're adapting a pattern. So definitely check out Sydney's Patreon so that you can get her patterns, because she has so many more that are beautiful. She even has some men's patterns, and I'm not gonna mention all of them because I do want to have all the designers in this video, but she's another very recommended vintage style designer. Now from some accessories, which again, I think is an easy way of getting into knitting vintage without committing too much, and that will make your outfits look so much better, starting with gloves. So definitely, because nowadays we only really wear gloves when it's cold out and maybe not all the time, but a lady from the 1950s probably would not leave her house without her gloves. And these are beautiful winter gloves that kind of remind me of that. They are wrist length, so they're very short, but they feature a gorgeous pattern of cables that goes on top of the glove. They're like snug gloves, which I think also enhances that like vintage look. And on top of that, like again, they are vintage style, but they are modern. So this is the Vintage Gloves Margaret by Vintage Alphine. And yeah, it is a design inspired by a lot of those vintage gloves that you see. I gotta say that this designer has a whole collection of vintage gloves. They would also make gorgeous gifts, I think, because they're so dainty and unique. So if you like cables, if you like gloves, and if you like vintage style, this is definitely something for you to look at. Sometimes I find patterns that have nothing vintage in mind. I think when they were designed, that maybe the designers weren't thinking of that. But when I look at them, they remind me of other stuff that I've seen from photographs or catalogs in vintage style, especially 1950s, 1940s, 1960s even, because we have more access to that stuff. And this pattern falls into that. It is the Seat Stitch Mittens by Pearl Soho, and it's a free pattern. They are simple mitten gloves with a seat stitch pattern on them, but because they are gloves that are more close to the skin, and then they go kind of halfway, about 2-3 inches past your wrist, I think they also have that like opera glove or winter glove, but like in the 50s, maybe even before that, just because of that look. And even the sample that they have on Ravelry, because of the colors, I think it's also reminded me of that. So this is a simple way of thinking about, when you find patterns, how can you integrate them into your outfit, vintage outfits. And this looks like a really simple, fun pattern for that. Let's talk about hats. And I have 2 hats that I recommend, very different styles. The first one is the Honeydew Cloche by Abby Knits. And of course, this is a cloche style of hat, which absolutely is 1920s. And I know a lot of people don't love the 1920s. I personally think it's a beautiful era of fashion, very unique and easy to wear. What I love about this hat is it's not only creating that cloche shape that goes around very close on your head and that has like a little fold in the back, but it also features a very, very beautiful lattice slip stitch design on top of it, which I think also kind of helps keep the shape of the hat. As for the description, it is knit in DK weight, so this feels like a very easy, very quick knit. And I'm really curious to knit it and see how it works, and if it actually like it stays in shape and looks as beautiful as it does on the model. And of course, you don't have to wear this with a 1920s style, but I think if you were to style it that way, it would absolutely look gorgeous. A hat that is timeless, but that in my head always gives vintage, is a beret. I think there are 100 beret patterns on Ravelry at least. I've seen so many, but one of my favorite ones, and one that I've actually made, is the Biz beret by Luna Knit, or Sari Nordlum. It is knit in a sport weight, but she recommends using 2 strands of fingering and 1 of lace that would be mohair, so that gives it like an extra nice look to it. It depends on what color you make and how you wear it, but I think it could definitely look 50s, it could look 60s, it could look basically a lot of different eras. They're such a basic item in my vintage wardrobe style. If you find another beret that you like better, sure, go for it, but always kind of think about it, how you can use that type of style to make your outfit look more of a certain era. And finally, for another accessory that people might not immediately think of when they think vintage, is socks. So of course, socks have not changed much over the years, but I think little details can make them have more of that vintage style. And one of them, I think, is any lace sock any sock that has a lot of lace in it. Even reminds me of the socks I used to wear as a little girl in the 90s. So I love this one, the Petal Drop Socks by Florence Miller. And it's a simple sock pattern. It has a beautiful lace design that goes on the leg and on the front of the sock. And it looks, I don't know, to me, I feel like these would look really cute with like 1950s shoes, or like a more young kind of vintage style. So it's a nice way of literally dipping your toes into vintage style. And then this other pattern, I'm going to remind you that the 80s and the 90s are over 25 years ago now. So it does count, I say. And it is a Happy Trails Natural Socks, which is a simple sock design with some ribbing on it and also 2 stripes at the top. And it immediately makes me think of 1980s, those sporty socks that people would wear with shorts. And if you're going for that, I think this counts as vintage. They also look really comfy, and you could probably buy this style of sock nowadays still, but nothing compares to handmade socks. So it's really nice that somebody came up on making this type of style come back into a knitting pattern. Oh, and this is a pattern by Heather Nolan from All In Knits, who I have mentioned before. I think she's a great designer. I also have a very special pattern because it doesn't fall into any category. It's a dress. It's a summer dress, and it's called the Fun Fan Summer Dress by Anna and Haiti Pickles. It is a beautiful, beautiful kind of A-line, I would call it, dress that features a fan design all over. It looks like such a fun dress to make and to wear, and it also looks very much like a 1960s mod mini dress, especially if you make it shorter, especially if you use certain colors, and you could make it with the long sleeve that she has in the pattern, or shorter sleeves. But honestly, I can totally see it with some go-go boots and like tights and like a nice beehive, and you're there, 1960s. It's such a fun pattern, and it recommends being knit in cotton yarn. It is sport weight yarn, so I think it would be very fun for the winter, but you could also style it for the fall. I love this dress. It looks really, really nice. I think I said this before, but I think cardigans, especially if they're like close to your body, not like the very slouchy type, those cardigans automatically to me give vintage, because I feel like people don't wear them as much nowadays, just in general. And also, of course, especially if you pair them where like they have the cardigan over another sweater that matches, very 1950s. This cardigan is the Mauritia cardigan by Alexandra Solovenuk. Sorry if I didn't say that right. And this is a beautiful cardigan, very simple one, but it does have a really nice cable design all over. And I also really like the sleeves because they're a little bit puffy, not too much, but they do end in like a little tighter, so that it gives it that very elegant, like dainty look. And it's also a very size inclusive pattern. I love the color and the way it's styled in the sample where she's wearing the cardigan under a dress. So I feel like that's what really is giving it that vintage look. You could style it other ways and make it look more modern, but I really like that whole outfit that she's wearing. One of my favorite design features of it is the way that she has the increases, the like raglan increases of the cardigan also have a cable knit. So it is just such a beautiful, if you like cable knitting, I feel like this is such a beautiful pattern to make. Okay, I've been going really fast because it's a very long list, but I have 2 more patterns of color work that I want to recommend to you. And the first one is actually a top sweater design by Susan Crawford. And if you don't know who Susan Crawford is, she is a very famous designer that is very experienced with vintage patterns, does a lot of reproductions, and this one is one of them. It's called the JoJo sweater, or just JoJo, and it's part of her series of Stitch in Time. She has these several volumes of books that show some of her vintage reproduction knitting. And if you don't know, this pattern is actually a reproduction of the sweater that was worn on the movie Jojo Rabbit, which is about 1940s Germany, by Scarlett Johansson. She's wearing this sweater, and I think I'm not the only one who, watching that movie, was obsessed with the costumes, especially this specific one. There's a lot of Pinterest posts about it that I found, and I'm so glad that somebody actually created a pattern based on it because it's such a beautiful sweater top. Again, very 1940s, all with the cut of like the more square sweater, but also still keeping that like shape that is more 1940s, the slightly puffed sleeves. And this one features color work, but it's actually a slip stitch type of color work. I think it's a little bit easier if you're not super knowledgeable on color work or if you've never done it before. It's a nice one to start with, and it uses a lot of different colors, so you can make your color combination or even use like leftover yarn of different projects to create your own patterns. It's a nice stash busting one. My favorite design feature in this one is that it actually has some buttons on the shoulder, so it's like a nice little detail that gives that extra vintage style. Of course, very 1940s. And the last color work pattern that I wanted to recommend to you is also a cardigan. This one requires sticking. If you don't know what sticking is, I do recommend you watch my vintage style vest video that I knitted a few months back, because that was my first time sticking, and it was like a whole thing. But now that I've done it, I'm not as scared of it, so I would totally make this cardigan. It is the Ultra Joke cardigan by Skinner Knits. I've already knit something by this designer before, and I think she's really great with color work. It's a simple cardigan, but it features, of course, a color work joke, which I think, I don't know if I would place it in a specific era. I think it would look really 1950s maybe. It's what I call generic vintage. It wasn't really designed to look a certain, era, but it does kind of fit a lot of them. So I would put it in that. It looks beautiful. I love the color coordination that she's doing with this white and yellow on the sample knit. And I always love color work yoke cardigans, that only have color work at the top. It's such a classic style of knitting, and it looks beautiful. So there you go. Those are all the patterns that I really recommend for you to try on if you want to get into vintage style knitting, or if you've been looking for more options but haven't quite found something. I have a link in the description for these patterns all together in a bundle, so you can find that on Ravelry and you can save them or start to make them or whatever you want, put them in your queue. And if you want to watch more videos where I touch on vintage style patterns or actual vintage patterns or making vintage patterns myself, definitely consider giving me a subscribe. And find me on Instagram if you'd like to see more of my day-to-day knitting. But in general, I hope you have a great day and that you enjoyed this video. Happy knitting!